So I read Hungerstone by Kat Dunn with the Weirdo Book Club this past March, and boy do I have thoughts. First and foremost, if you like talking about books and if you like them to be just a little bit avant-garde, Weirdo Book Club is for you. I will have links down in the description so that you can join that conversation if you'd like. As of recording, we've already had our monthly meeting for this book, and the discussion was excellent. But I am a yapper and could go on forever, which is why we're going to do our own standalone review now. My overall take here is that Hungerstone is mid. There's a lot of things it's executing at a very high level and doing interesting things with, but overall I feel like I was let down by the speculative elements, particularly the vampire things. Like, I just needed more supernatural than we were getting, and even though I love a slow burn, this was a little bit too slow a burn for me. Spoilers from here on out for Hungerstone, and I also want to throw a content warning in here for discussion about eating disorders or disordered eating. So some general thoughts. One of the main reasons I want to talk about this book so much is, in theory, this should be something I loved and gave an easy 5 stars to. I love moody vampire traumatic stuff, I like things set in the Victorian era, and generally I love a slow burn. All of this should have come together and really cemented my adoration of Kat Dunn. And I think the issue really comes down to execution, as well as what my expectations were going in versus what Kat Dunn was actually trying to do. But there's no denying this book is very clever and references a lot of classic literature. Besides being a spin on Carmilla, our main character's name is Lenore, and who doesn't love that kind of callback to Edgar Allan Poe? And given what happens to Lenore throughout this tale, I actually think her name sort of foreshadows some of what she's facing and the kind of dangers that are ahead of her. And credit to Kat Dunn, because the sapphic element is done extremely well in this book. I feel like the relationship is fully fleshed out, the spice is really spicing, the dates are very cute, they're kind of frank and honest conversations are revealing. Of course, all of that is in the back third of the book, because for the first 2/3, Carmilla and Lenore are at a very adversarial, confusing, cross-talking sort of relationship. And I guess that's my issue, is the first 2/3 of this book are so frustrating. Carmilla is just a bitchy vague poster for most of this. You know, big props to Kat Dunn, because she does turn it around in the back third. I really love their relationship. I'm really rooting for them. I think it's very sweet. She does manage successfully to make me completely change my opinions on Carmilla in the back. I was just so angry and frustrated for so long. And I don't know why the relationship had to be that way. Why a little bit more communication or a little bit of some kind of blend of something couldn't have made that a little more compelling a little earlier in. Also, general disclaimer, if you are not used to vampire fiction or vampire spice scenes, then this might be a little bit jarring for you. When Carmilla and Lenore finally cement their feelings and get together with physical intimacy as well as perhaps emotional understanding, there is biting going on. And I think the description of it works really well. But if you're not used to that vampiric biting kind of thing, I think this is going to be a lot for you. And let's briefly talk about that twist reveal. So I think some people are stunned when they find out Lenore's husband Henry has been poisoning her with the pastels that he's been gifting her with and she's been binge eating. For me, I was a lot less surprised, because Lenore is feeling unwell the entirety of the book, and she seems to be getting progressively worse, which, to be fair, you could chalk up as a lingering issue with the carriage accident she was in as a child. Or there are a couple other things in her environment that could be poisoning her, like her room has green wallpaper in it and she's wearing green dresses. And we know in this time period that green was often created through a radioactive element that would poison the people who were wearing it and living in it. For me personally, it was a little bit of a toss-up whether or not Lenore was just being poisoned by her environment or whether or not Henry was actively poisoning her. And I was leaning towards Henry actively poisoning her because of the kind of story we were in. Now, I was surprised a little bit by Henry's lack of foresight on the matter. It's one thing for him to be ungrateful for everything Lenore does for him. And it's par for the course for men in that time period, and even a little bit now, to take women's work for granted or not to acknowledge it as actual labor. But it's another thing to think that you can murder your wife and everything that she was doing will just magically get done. Like, Lenore's in the middle of a bunch of party planning, she's in the middle of a bunch of redecorating, she's keeping up with all the workmen, making sure everything's getting done. She's receiving huge packages of like books and stuff at the house while Henry is away, telling those people where to put them. And then she's like unpacking them and setting up the library and stuff. Like, that's no small feat, and Henry cannot be in two places at once, so like literally he cannot work and also get that done. And it would be wild for him to assume that like a servant could do that as well as Lenore's doing it right now, or that they would even care to do so. Like, objectively, Henry's life is so much better with Lenore in it. I do have to wonder what the motivation for poisoning her was. And that's not to mention all of Henry's personal insecurities, that the only way he's gotten into like this old money, noble blood kind of circles is because Lenore has old money blood. Not that I guess Henry's motivations really matter in this story. This is very focused on Lenore's journey. And revealing that she's being poisoned by her husband, someone she's doing everything for, is what tips the balance between her like behaving and being a good woman in society and deciding that she is ready to be free at all costs and to get her vengeance on this awful, small, petty man. And of course, having her poisoned this way also allows Carmilla's often repeated line, "You're feeding the wrong hunger," to have multiple meanings. Because those candies she's eating are literally poisoning her. But those candies are also a symbol of Lenore choosing to eat her feelings, choosing to bury her own selfishness, her own desire and need in service of another. And that sort of like tips the scales for like Lenore to be hungry and for her hunger to be validated on all fronts, because this man is literally killing her as well as like emotionally doing so. And also I want to compare Clara and Carmilla for a minute. These are two ladies that are first and foremost in Lenore's life. Clara is one of her dearest friends slash frenemies, where Carmilla is this woman who starts out adversarially and later becomes Lenore's lover and sort of like falls into her lap after a carriage accident strands her with them. And I think this comparison is quite interesting because Clara and Carmilla are sort of like opposite ends of the feminine spectrum, if you will. Clara is like the embodiment of what all feminine Victorian ladies should aspire to be, and she does it with ease and joy. And Carmilla is demanding and the embodiment of everything that's like a rejection of the societal expectation in place for women. And I think this kind of explains Lenore's frenemy status with Clara, because in the beginning Lenore loves Clara, adores her, but also kind of wants to be her and is angry at herself that she cannot be like Clara is. And also, like, because Lenore is so unhappy in this role and Clara is more or less filling the same role and super stoked about it, it makes Lenore more likely to be suspicious of her. Like, how could she be happy? How could this be fulfilling? There's no way eating so little satisfies her hunger. But here's the thing, Lenore is just not like Clara at all. She is much more similar to Carmilla. So as she leans into her true self and what will actually make her happy, that makes her further and further away from Clara and also like more suspicious of her. And in the end, it's that suspicion between the two differences in these women that gets Clara killed, which is a lot to process because Lenore was suspicious of Clara having an affair with Henry from the jump. They end up having a confrontation and Clara swears on her life that she's not having an affair with Henry and kind of like explains why the two are close behind Lenore's back. And we realize the whole situation is actually Henry's fault. And Lenore also recognizes that Clara is a super genuine person, is really trying to be friends with her, trying to help and support her, and minimally trying not to undermine her. But as Lenore goes on this journey of self-discovery and realizes she's more and more like Carmilla, it pulls her further and further away from Clara, and it makes it hard for her to remember that sincerity, hard for her to hold on to it, and it's where that rope snaps and she completely breaks from society and their expectation and living up to those goals, where she ends up killing Clara. And you know, to be fair, Clara, for her part, no longer can predict or understand Lenore, and she is a little skittish of her, like, going into her final scene. But it's still quite tragic because Clara does believe she's helping Lenore this whole time. When she's like having these secret conversations with Henry, she's doing it to help Lenore. She's keeping it secret on Henry's Henry's request because Henry said it would upset Lenore. She's sticking around and watching her friend because the other option for Lenore is for her to go to an asylum. And this change is incredibly sudden. I'm sure Clara is afraid that Lenore is having some kind of break from reality. In like her world, there's no place where Henry might be poisoning her and Lenore is trying to break free. And I think Clara can't conceive of a world where Lenore wasn't happy in her relationship in her place because Clara is so happy. Which to me makes all of this even more tragic. And if we pull away from the book a little bit and just talk about like the two spectrums of women being Clara and Carmilla, I think the messaging of the book is quite sad because it seems to be implying you cannot be friends with both ends of this spectrum, or you can't like empathize and have good conversations and interactions with both kind of people. Like if Lenore is our middle person who started closer to Clara's side of the spectrum but not quite directly on her and travels all the way over to Carmilla's side, as she travels these lines, she's less able to speak to Clara over here, more able to speak to Carmilla. And when they start, more able to communicate with Clara, less able to communicate with Carmilla. It's like a very binary shifting scale slider for her. It's almost like Clara and Carmilla are speaking foreign languages to each other. And while I don't agree with the either or nature of these relationships, it also has me asking some broader questions. If Lenore must choose one friendship or one way of seeing the world, which of these two outlooks is better? And I can't help but observing that while Clara's friendship is genuine in her own way, it lacks depth and intensity or the openness that it seems like Lenore is really hungering for in her relationships. And with Carmilla, they share everything. Hurts, fears, joy, as well as a romantic intimacy. And this kind of holds like interest in me because I suppose both Clara and Carmilla are working in good faith and are being friends in their own way with Lenore. But despite Clara's best intentions and thinking she's very close to Lenore and doing the best she can by her friend, she is not providing the right kind of friendship for Lenore at this point in time. And it's sort of interesting to look at people who are on opposite ends of the spectrum and think about maybe they are being incredibly good faith and showing you what being a friend would look like to them, and it's just not the right kind of thing for you no matter how hard they're trying. And the same of course goes in reverse, like you're not a good friend for them either. I don't know, overall I did find the extremity of killing Clara cruel and unnecessary. As Lenore has fully converted to Carmilla's path, she has no use for Henry anyways. So part of me is like, even if you truly believe that Clara is trying to sleep with him or is sleeping with him, what do you even care? Plus, like, just the night before, you saw him with even another girl, so it's gonna be like Clara versus that other girl after you leave. And given that Lenore and Clara did have that confrontation earlier, and Clara was so sincere and shocked about the idea that Lenore might believe she was sleeping with Henry, why does that not hold more weight now, even in this one moment? And that rolls me into talking about the thematic elements of hunger within the book, starting with literal hunger. The recipes and the descriptions of the food are supremely good. They feel very authentic and grounded. It creates this visceral sense of what the food is, like it's actually in front of me in the moment. And I think part of how Kat Dunn achieved this is she also talks about how her characters are feeling in relation to food. Like obviously a lot of the times Lenore's just so hungry, but sometimes she's like too nauseous to eat, sometimes she finds the food satiating, sometimes it's like cardboard. It's these extra dimensions that really make the food feel real instead of like this idealized glossy magazine picture. And I think the way that Kat Dunn uses food and also uses hunger rolls us into like disordered eating that we kind of see throughout the book. And I do think this metaphor she's using would make this book very hard for some people sensitive to eating disorders to read. And that's in part because there's an in-depth examination of how women historically and still now eat their feelings, which can of course be applied to men and all people, but in this case this is something that disproportionately happens to women. With Lenore, she's turning to these overly sweet pastels every time she's supremely upset. And it's not like having a little sweet pick-me-up treat. She binge eats an entire bin of these pastels every time she's feeling distressed. I mean, she eats these past the point of being full, and also once she's done with the act of eating them, she feels entirely disgusted with herself, nauseous, sometimes to the point of throwing up right after finishing. And it is like a combination of factors with her in these pastels. It could be that she's really had too much sugar and is over overly full in too short an amount of time and it's made her sick. It could just be her internal loathing and disgust at her lack of control. It could be how miserable she is comes surging back as soon as that act of eating is over. But I think the pros and Lenore herself do a really good job of mixing all these things together, sort of explaining why disordered eating is such a hard issue to tackle, because it's not just one element. Like, if you wanted to fix this problem for Lenore, first you'd have to tackle whatever is triggering her to eat the pastels, which in this case is a ton of suffering, misery, lack of mobility within her world. And then even when you improved her circumstances, you would have to sub in some other kind of coping mechanism, because she's going to be miserable some of the time no matter what plan you make. And on top of that, since she has such a specific trigger in the pastels specifically, you'd have to sort of like desensitize her to that. And because Lenore's misery is put upon her by her relationship, by her place in society, by her financial standing, there's just so many barriers of entry. It makes it quite easy to see why it's easier for her just to binge eat. And on the other end of the spectrum, we actually have Lenore's friend Clara, who never eats a full meal. I mean, she eats like 3 grapes and is full. It's something Lenore has opportunity to describe over many meals, how she takes like smaller portions, like less than half of what Lenore is taking, and then eats maybe half of that and claims to be full. And of course that harkens back to a whole other kind of disordered eating where you just point blank refuse to eat, and like this is the one thing in your life you can control when everything else is outside of your purview. And it's sort of heavily implying that even though Claire is like the perfect Victorian lady and appears perfectly content and happy with her place in the world, maybe she is also struggling and secretly miserable, and this is like her one form of control or like way for her to get through her own day. And all of this rolls very smoothly into hunger as a metaphor, because disordered eating is about more than just not eating the right way and making yourself sick. It's usually about some kind of psychology trigger that's happening to you. And because of that, I think most people can see why food and hunger is very intuitively paired with suffering, misery, unhappiness in your own life, a hunger for adventure or for something new or different or more than you have in your life right now. And Lenore in particular hungers for so much. Like, she wants a true partner in her marriage. She wants the ability both to fulfill her side of their relationship, but also to receive recognition for all she does. And perhaps even to have a partner who considers the vast amount of work they're asking her to do and lets her have some input in scheduling things as a result. She wants a true friend who she can actually trust and confide in. She wants financial stability, the security to stick her head up out of the sand and look at what else there is. She wants a single element in her life that is just for herself and not an act of service to others. And of course there's like the sexual hunger waiting in the wings, because of course there is in Victorian times. But even though the period of this piece makes these things easier to talk about, makes them clearer and more obvious to a modern audience how and why this woman is suffering and how she is limited, it applies very much to like the modern plight for many women today as well. Especially if you get into like the sexual element where things are just weird when you talk about women's desire, whether or not they have any, whether it's right or wrong to do so, whether or not you should lean into them or the women should just be good and polite little bed partners, whether a woman's struggle with this is a personal failing on her part, like she's not trying enough, or whether or not this is a lack of occasion or something that could happen at all with the right partner mix or the right thing going on. It's all something we see Lenore present and struggling with in her day-to-day life when she meets Carmilla, who seems to be a dark mirror for her. She shames no one for the hunger that they have or what they do to pursue it. And in fact, Carmilla seems to understand that people will do extreme things, anything, to stay sated. And perhaps all roads right now are leading me to The Indifferent Stars Above, a nonfiction book I read earlier this year about the Donner Party tragedy. But in it, it outlines a ton of things that people ate trying to stay alive that are not perishable and have no nutritional value. But when you take that knowledge that when you're in an extreme situation, you will eat anything to fill your belly, and you take the metaphor of hunger and see how constrained Lenore's life is and many of these other Victorian women, it's very unsurprising that they're eating hair, they're eating raw chicken, they're eating wallpaper and wood chairs, they're killing their husbands and cooking their meat. That's the least. Like, there is a certain level of starvation that leads one to insanity, along with like like a driving biological need. So when you pair this comparison with what these women are suffering, all of it kind of like makes sense and feels justified in a nice kind of poetic, flowy sort of way. Heck, I also read Victorian Psycho the same month I read Hungerstone, and in it, the titular Psycho is also very attracted to raw bird, meat, bone, and fat. And in a lot of ways, I think you could make some interesting comparisons between her and Carmilla as well. But beyond all that, I think the metaphor of hunger and suffering and sating those urges is probably the closest we get to actually making a good use of the supernatural speculative vampire element here. In most stories, the vampire is horrified by their own hunger, that driving need to consume human blood, to take human life. It's usually this juxtaposition of them hungering and trying to hold back, and them like giving into that need and therefore sustaining their life, but causing suffering for those around them and themselves in the process. Here, Carmilla is 100% unapologetic about what she is, what she needs, what she drives others to do. She's full girl supporting girls' wrongs here. Carmilla sort of argues that it is right, necessary, the only option to seek your own freedom and your own survival, and whatever you have to do to achieve that is justified. Again, this brings us back to Carmilla's tagline, "You're feeding the wrong hunger." It sort of gets us asking the hows and the whys of it, which I think are quite important, because Lenore is quite trapped. And I think everybody has been at a place in their life where they feel really trapped by their own making, by circumstances, by a host of different variables, and they're looking at it and saying, well, damn, how do I get out of this? And while I think it's pretty easy to see the self-sabotage, the self-destructive spiral that got Lenore where she's at, it is significantly less obvious to me what Lenore should be doing instead. And I do think that's part of where the hunger metaphor and the narrative as a whole is kind of lacking, because Lenore does break herself free, which is good or whatever, but her process to go from point A to point Z is not intuitive at all. It takes up only the back third of the book, so it happens very quickly in compared to the slow burn that took us there, and it's not like a good tutorial how to follow self-discovery process anyone could endeavor on. Like, I don't really understand how it came about. It's just like, go girl, it worked out for you. And I just think like a little bit more frank conversation, a little bit more thought process, like clear line from how she got from point A to Z would have been very helpful to me. And then lastly, Henry is poisoning Lenore through food. And I think that that's an interesting way to incorporate the theme of hunger and satiation within the story too, especially because it's these poisoned pastels that are killing Lenore. Gnawing on hair, raw chicken, wallpaper, wood, even a husband's fat. None of that kills these women. Letting someone else tell you what you need and supply you with it is what leads to Lenore's poisoning. Attempting to eat one's emotions, even if it's with a bit of sweetness, is what's killing Lenore. Indulging in a guilty pleasure because you cannot bear the reality of your own life is what's poisonous in this book. And last but not least, let's talk about the Hunger Stone. So if you're like me and you don't know what a Hunger Stone is, apparently back in agricultural times, you know, they would go through droughts and famines and all that kind of stuff. And one way for people to predict when that would happen is they would like mark it on a stone in the river, and if the water got below there so the Hunger Stone went dry, that's when they knew a famine was happening and they would start to go hungry. And I think this is a way for Carmilla to sort of like help Lenore prep for what's about to happen, because she's sated right now, but she is going into a famine time, and she needs to keep her eye on her own Hunger Stone to know when things have gone too far or gone too long, and maybe she needs to get herself out regardless of whether or not she got what she needed for vengeance from Henry. And that kind of rolls me into this book's exploration of feminine rage. Lenore is many things when we first open the book. Wounded, confused, lost, sad. But under all of that is this simmering anger and resentment, because she should have never been in that life-altering carriage wreck, because her aunt should have loved and protected her as a child, because her husband, if he couldn't manage to love her, should still appreciate, respect, and acknowledge her. She should be like Clara, bright, loquacious, and happy. but she is just herself. Still pretty, but quiet, melancholy, a little introverted, never quite saying the right thing at the right time. Her choices have been so limited by her gender, her financial status, her social place and time. It's placed her in a cage that makes her miserable, that she sees no way out of, that she is literally dying in. Lenore gets like a 1-2 punch from Henry, first learning that he is not anywhere near as competent or capable in his business as she first assumed, seeing significant brutality at the metalworking industry he's at, as well as learning he's not even compensating their families for these deaths. And then she finds out this bastard is also poisoning her. These two things happening so close together twist and combine to eliminate all of that stagnation and depression and leave nothing but raw animal rage in its wake. Because if she's gonna die, she might as well die free. If she's gonna die, she might as well die while defying Henry and being herself and happy. If she's going to die, she may as well love who she pleases and have the relationship she wants while she can. Which rolls me into the role of the vampire in this story. On its face, the inclusion of the supernatural makes sense in this story. In execution, for me at least, there's definitely something missing, but it's sort of hard to pinpoint exactly what's missing because Carmilla is definitely odd in a way that suggests she's divorced from humanity. She does appear adverse to direct sunlight, she doesn't like gravesites, she cannot cross the barrier of holy ground at a church, she has trouble eating normal food, and she goes walking in the moors at night, all of which is pretty generic vampire shit. Not to mention when Carmilla and Lenore have their steamy scene, Carmilla bites Lenore and drinks her blood, and Lenore returns the favor. So you could say that's very traditional vampire core. Of course, there are also like a couple of mundane explanations for a lot of Carmilla's oddness. Like possibly Carmilla is just having a lot of trauma from her carriage accident. And Victorian women of this time did avoid the sunlight because they wanted to have very pale skin. It's also possible that she's just odd because she's a wealthy socialite and like used to getting her way, saying what she wants when she wants. And like with the right backstory, avoiding church grounds and death and stuff could just be part of who she is. It doesn't have to be necessarily supernatural. Like to a certain degree, Carmilla is giving huge Dorian Gray energy, and I realize that Dorian Gray is another fictional supernatural character who gets to be immortal thanks to a portrait, but that dude was like that before the portrait gave him the youth and immortality. As someone who loves a supernatural speculative element, the lack of clarity here is really frustrating. Not like in a fun, maybe she is, maybe she isn't way, more in like a we could have used this sort of way. Like I would love a moment where Lenore sees Carmilla and like really has an out of body moment where she realizes Carmilla is not human. And I think that could have further driven this story in an interesting direction. Perhaps like acknowledging as society stands, women just don't feed their hungers, and it does take this supernatural something more to push them in that direction. About how women have to step outside of themselves and outside of society to really see how hungry they are or figure out how to feed that hunger. And I think a conversation about what the vampire sacrifices versus what it means to be a mortal woman wouldn't have gone askew. It really could have deepened the contrast between Clara and Carmilla. It could have gone a long way to validating Clara's life, and that could have opened up a conversation about how progress, giving more power to many, doesn't always empower everyone and might leave some of those people behind. And I do think like not exploring what one has to sacrifice to be a vampire is a disservice. Not just to the supernatural speculative vampire element, but to the choices that Lenore is making in story. Kat Dunn did a great job making Carmilla's presence felt, even when she wasn't around, but her meaning is never clear. From my point of view, Carmilla is more like a Dionysian Maenad than she is a vampire, someone who embraces madness and upends society. But I think this story is a little bit too grounded to really embrace the concept of Maenads, madness, and dreaming in that way, although it's got a good handle on the savage justice element of it. And I suppose just overall, the exploration of the vampire here doesn't work as well as making Carmilla another kind of supernatural creature might. And partially that's because I'm from the Anne Rice school of vampires. They come to mean sorrow, this selfish hunger that ends up being self-destructive to everyone they try to pull close to have those relationships with, and they end up being nothing but loneliness and misery. But then Anne Rice's vampires are mostly men, and they are making larger points about overindulgence and self-sabotage and selfishness. And I think they're also warning against the desire for eternity, the madness that follows that, making these vampires as dangerous as any psychopath. But I think some of the contrast is definitely missing in Carmilla because her selfishness is perpetually rewarded. Her destruction of the many starving women in the town surrounding her is seen as a liberation or like a success of some sort, as if maybe she's a catalyst for the inevitable within these women, and that these women are better off indulging than living a full life. And Carmilla herself seems sated and content in all things. She doesn't have that stereotypical vampire loneliness. She doesn't seem to be seeking to feed a specific brand of hunger at all. And it almost elevates her way above the rest of the people in this narrative. This is a long-winded way to say that Carmilla as a character lacks balance, and I don't think I particularly liked this portrayal. So bringing us to conclusions. You can tell the author wrote this from a place of personal authenticity, of like deep rage, anger, going through something. And I think Hungerstone works decently as a character study. It's a slow burn where much of what was about to happen was self-evident to me, but not our narrator, and where I didn't feel like the back end paid off all of that long drudgery to build in. Quite a bit of it felt cruel and mean-spirited without any real purpose. And while this is a book about feminine rage and hunger and sating, ironically, it left me hungry for something more transformative and powerful than you can find in this tome. Hungerstone does a great job exploring that anger, that helplessness, the injustices of where we place certain people in society and what their options are. It stumbles on the transformative element, which left me feeling like the author alone wanted to experience this anger, and the only reason our character gets any closure was to finish the narrative arc, not because it was naturally able to happen or is anything that anyone else could do. And the more I think about it, the more I really believe Hungerstone is an expression of rage, and that's all it really means to do. And it does execute well on that, although I think it's a little bit lopsided as a story. Overall, I'd say Kat Dunn is a highly talented author. This is executed really well, and it just isn't for me. But that's everything I think and feel about Hungerstone. Talk to me in those comments down below. Have you read this book, and how did you think the vampire was represented? And as always, keep reading.